Well, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, but really I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes. It's no good now, you know, said the fawn, laying down its flute and shaking its head at her, very sorrowfully. No good? Said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what's happened to me. But a moment later she asked, Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter? For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and then the tears began trickling down its cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of his nose. And at last it covered its face with its hands and began to howl. Mr. Tumnus! Mr. Tumnus! Said Lucy in great distress. Don't! What's the matter? Aren't you well, Mr. Tumnus? Do tell me what's wrong, please. But the fawn continued sobbing, as if its heart would break, and even when Lucy went over and put her arms around him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be any more use. And so, presently, Lucy was standing in a damp patch. Mr. Tumnus! Bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking. Do stop! Stop it at once! You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about? Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn. I don't think you're a bad fawn at all, said Lucy. I think you're a very good fawn. You're the nicest fawn I've ever met. Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew, replied Mr. Tumnus between his sobs. No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there was ever a worse fawn since the beginning of the world. But what have you done? Said Lucy. My old father now, said Mr. Tumnus. That's his picture over the mantel. He would never have done a thing like this, never. A thing like what? Said Lucy. Like what I've done, said the fawn. Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch. What, the White Witch? Well, who is she, Mr. Tumnus? Why, it is she who has got Narnia under her thumb. It's she who always makes its winter. Or always wear winter. Never Christmas. Think of that. How awful, said Lucy. But what does she pay you for? That's the worst of it, said Mr. Tumnus with a deep groan. I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that had never done any harm, pretend to be friendly, invite it into my home, to my cave, all the sake for lulling it asleep, and then handing it over to the White Witch? No, said Lucy. I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort. But I have, said the fawn. Well, said Lucy rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not too hard on him. Well, that was pretty bad, but you're so sorry for it, I'm sure you'd never do it again. Daughter of Eve, don't you understand? It isn't something I have done. It's something I'm doing right now, at this very moment. What do you mean? Said Lucy, turning very white. You are the child, said Mr. Tumnus. I had orders from the White Witch that if I ever saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them, to hand them over to her. And you are the first I've ever met. I've pretended to be your friend and I've asked you for tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait till you were asleep, and then go. Tell her. But you wouldn't, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't, Mr. Tumnus. And if I don't, he began to cry again. She's sure to find out, and then she'll have my tail cut off, my horns sawn off, my beard plucked out. She'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hoofs and turn them into horrid solid hoofs, like a wretched horse's. And if she's specially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall be put as a statue of a faun in her horrible house until the 4 thrones of Car Paravel are filled. And goodness knows when that will happen, or whether it will ever happen at all. I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but please let me go home. Of course I will, said the faun. Of course, I've got it, I see that now. I hadn't known that humans were like you before I met you. Of course, I can't give you up to the witch. Not now that I know you, but we must be off. We must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your way from there, back to Spare and Wardrobe? I'm sure I can, said Lucy. Then we must go. Quietly, quickly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side. They both got up, and they left the tea things on the table. Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella, gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey back was not at all like the journey to the Fawn's Cave the first time. They stole along as quickly as they could without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamp-post again. Do you know the way from here, daughter of Eve? Said Mr. Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees, and she could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off, as quick as you can, said the fawn. And can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do? Why, of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand. And I do hope you won't get into terrible trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve, he said. Perhaps I may keep the handkerchief? Rather, said Lucy, and then ran towards the far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her little legs would carry her. And presently, instead of a rough branch brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt wooden boards. And all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around. Panting for breath, it was still raining. She could hear the voices of the others in the passage. I'm here, she shouted. I'm here! I've come back!